Hello and welcome to Chapter 13, the Economic Environment of Business and Finance. So you can probably guess from the title that this chapter is all about economics, and this is one of the few places in your studies that you have to study economics. And it's a great subject, so it's a shame in some ways that it all needs to be crammed into one chapter. Really interesting stuff. It's got a lot of real-world application, I think, as you'll see as we work our way through the chapter. So it's just useful stuff to know, as well as being vital in terms of getting you through the exam. So I hope you enjoy it. It's quite a long one, this chapter, so we'll need to break it down into manageable chunks. But let's make a start, shall we? First of all, introduction. Okay, now what this section is doing is introducing us to two key terms with economics. We've got macroeconomics and we've got microeconomics. Now, my old economics tutor always used to say to us that macro has got an A in it, okay, and that stands for all. Okay, so macroeconomics is the study of the whole economy, so everything that's going on, national, even international stuff would fall into the heading of macroeconomics, whereas microeconomics has got an I in it, and that stands for individual. So microeconomics is the study of individual markets. Okay, and what we do is we basically put all those individual markets together to become the macro economy. So macroeconomics is all about this stuff that you see in the news all the time. Things like, business cycle, boom and bust. It's all about government policies, and you may have heard of fiscal and monetary policies, interest rates, exchange rates, inflation. Okay, so it's all the big stuff which affects the whole economy. Microeconomics is individual markets, individual businesses. Okay, and an important part of microeconomics is going to be looking at something called the price mechanism. Okay, and you may have heard people talk about demand and supply. You may have come across demand and supply in previous studies which you've done, and that's the market mechanism, the price mechanism. And we will cover that in some detail later on in this chapter. Now, starting with the macroeconomic environment, the first thing we're doing in section 2.1 is talking about the national economy. Okay, and there are expressions here like national output, and we sometimes call this GDP, or gross domestic product. So this is the total output, the total value of all goods and services which your economy produces. And in the world of economics, this output is produced by what are known as factors of production. Okay, the things which make these goods and services. Now, in order to make goods and services, according to an economist, you need four things. You need land, labour, capital, and entrepreneurship. So land are your buildings. Yeah, office buildings, factory buildings, and obviously the land that they're built on. Labour are your workers. Okay, and that would include managers. Yeah, so reasonably senior workers, so managers, directors. You also need capital. Okay, so that's the money that's invested in the business, and we know that comes from a variety of sources, don't we? It comes from shareholders, it comes from banks, it comes from money lenders. And you also need your entrepreneur, yeah, enterprise. Now, this is the person who gets everything else organized. Yeah, these are the people who set up businesses. Yeah, they buy a building, they hire workers, they invest their own money and borrow money. Okay, and they're the ones that set up businesses and drive the economy. Now, each of these factors of production earn returns or rewards. And again, in the world of economics, the reward for land is rent. So imagine you're a landlord, you let somebody else use your land, you receive rent for that. The reward for workers is obviously wages. The reward for capital is interest. Okay, we don't talk too much about dividends in the world of economics, so the reward for capital is interest. So imagine someone has lent money, and the reward for enterprise or entrepreneurship is profit. Okay, so the entrepreneur will have to pay these other things out first. He'll have to pay rent for his building, he'll have to pay wages to his workers, he'll have to pay interest on his debt. What he's got left is his profit. Now, we've said gross domestic product is the total value of output of the economy. Now, another way of saying that is also the total value of expenditure incurred by people within that economy. Now, who can buy national output? Well, we can, can't we? Households or consumers, as we're known in economics. But the government buys things. Yeah, so they are a specific type of consumer. They can consume some of our national output. And also overseas buyers. Yeah, we can export, can't we? So we produce things in this country, we sell them overseas, so we can have exports. Now, there's an important role for the government in the way the national economy operates. Okay, the government plays a number of roles. Okay, first of all, the government itself produces certain goods and services. Yeah, think of the public sector, all those organisations owned by the government producing goods and services. As we've just said, it also buys goods and services produced by the private sector. The government invests, capital expenditure by the government, things like building roads, schools, hospitals. And the government also makes these things called transfer payments. Okay, now a transfer payment, in the world of economics, is a payment for no output. Okay, so whereas wages are a return for the effort that you put in when you go to work, a transfer payment is a payment but in return for nothing, effectively, and this is all about the welfare state. Yeah, things like paying benefits. Those are known as transfer payments. So obviously the government spends a sizable proportion of its budget on these transfer payments. Now, if that's the role of the government, what about the role of the consumer? Well, basically the role of the consumer is to consume, isn't it? It's to buy things. And we buy things with our disposable income. Now, what do we mean by disposable income? Well, it's any income that we have after we've paid all our tax. So again, the government's got a role to play there because they can help determine the amount of disposable income we've all got by either increasing or reducing the rate of tax in the economy. Now, what do consumers do with disposable income? Well, a big proportion of it they spend or consume. So we spend it on goods and services. The other choice we've got, of course, is to save it and maybe use it for consumption in the future. So this word consumption, expenditure, okay, this is expenditure by households. So forget the government sector now, this is expenditure by households. Now, what affects the level of consumption, the level of expenditure by households in the economy? Well, first of all, it's affected by the level of disposable income which we have. So the more disposable income, presumably the more we spend, the more consumption is undertaken. But it's also affected by this thing here called the marginal propensity to consume, MPC. Now, what does this mean? Well, marginal propensity to consume, whenever you see the word marginal, it means one extra, doesn't it? So our marginal propensity to consume is how much of each extra pound do we spend. So if, for instance, we had a marginal propensity to consume of, 0.8, that would mean for every extra pound that we earn, 80 pence of it is spent. Okay, and that can fluctuate. Okay, in some economies it might be higher than in other economies. In very wealthy economies, maybe it's not so high because the individuals, the households in that economy save a lot of their money rather than spending it. Whereas with very poor economies or poor households, the marginal propensity to consume is very high. Any extra pound of income is pretty much spent straight away. And that's why changes in the distribution of wealth can also affect total consumption in the economy. If there's a redistribution away from the rich towards the poor, consumption will tend to rise, because the less well off you are, the higher your marginal propensity to consume. It can be affected by government policy. Things like tax rates. The higher the tax rate, the lower our marginal propensity to consume will be. The lower the tax rate, the more money we've got to spend. Development of new products. Great new products are developed, we want to buy them, so our expenditure goes up. As well as being affected by tax, it could also be affected by interest rates, can't it? If interest rates go up, we all have to pay more mortgage interest, so we've got less money left to spend, so consumption will fall. And here's an interesting thing which comes up a number of times in this chapter. Expectations can influence consumption. For instance, if we expect prices to rise, what we might do is go out and spend a lot more now, quick, before the prices do rise. Equally, if we expect prices to fall, what we might do is hang on, wait for those prices to fall, and then we will plan to spend the money in the future. But at the moment, our consumption will drop. So expectations has a role to play. Now, what we don't spend, we tend to save. So again, it's rather simplistic, isn't it? But we do simplify things a little bit in economics. Saving is the amount of income which is not consumed. So what factors influence the level of savings? Well, again, this is the reverse of consumption almost. It's the amount of income that you have. And the more income you have, the more you will save. The less income you have, the less you will save. And not only less will you save, but you will save a smaller proportion of your income. So better off households, better off economies will save a much greater proportion of their income. Interest rates will affect the level of saving, won't they? If interest rates go up, the return on saving improves, so we will all be incentivized to put more money in the banks. While interest rates are very low, maybe you think, well, we might as well spend it then. It's going to earn nothing sitting in the bank, so I might as well go on that foreign holiday that I've always wanted to go on. And it's also affected by long-term savings. And the point with long-term savings is you put your money away and you can't get at it for years and years and years. So it's maybe not as susceptible to short-term fluctuations in things like interest rates and in the rest of the economy. You could put your money into a 5 or 10-year savings bond, okay, and then it really is locked away. So as households, we either consume our income or we save it. What about businesses? Well, businesses will do an awful lot of investment. And what we mean by investment is a whole host of things. Businesses buy a lot of fixed capital, so buildings, machinery, plant and equipment. Okay, they also buy stock. And in economics, that is also a form of investment. Now, what influences the level of investment? Well, similar things actually, the level of interest rates. If interest rates go up, firms will find it harder to borrow money and therefore harder to invest. Okay, so there tends to be an inverse relationship between interest rates and investment. Again, expectations. If a firm expects the economy to grow, perhaps it's incentivized to invest now so that it will be able to meet the increase in demand of its customers in the future. So if we expect the economy to grow, we invest now to deal with that increase. If we expect the economy to go into recession, maybe we cut back on investment. Investment is also triggered by consumer demand. If our customers do start to buy more things, then we will need to invest to keep up with that demand. The phrase here, opportunity cost of investment. Now, opportunity cost, this is the way we measure costs in economics. So we don't do it the way accountants do it. Okay, now we've got an economist hat on in this chapter. We measure costs by this concept called opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is the next best alternative foregone. Okay, that's the opportunity cost. So what opportunity have you missed out on because you undertook this particular course of action? So the opportunity cost of investment is, well, what would have been the next best thing you could have done with that money? Okay, and if the next best thing actually becomes more attractive, then you will invest less. If the next best thing becomes less attractive, maybe you will invest more. Also, levels of new technology. Okay, as technology improves, businesses are forced to invest in that new technology to keep pace with their competitors. Yeah. So, I mean, the one that immediately sprung to mind then was the newspaper industry, where there was, I don't know, sort of 20 years ago, a huge shift as technology changed. Okay, and all the old sort of printing presses were defunct. Okay, and the whole of Fleet Street had to update very, very quickly. Now, investment comes from two places. It comes from the private sector, so from firms in the private sector. And they can invest either from the profits that they've earned, which they haven't paid out to their shareholders, or they can ask their shareholders for more money, or they can borrow. Okay, now, we're going to talk about this very, very shortly in the next section, in fact, but in an economic recession, profits are going to be low, and investors might lack confidence. Okay, so raising finance by issuing new shares is going to be very, very difficult, and therefore potentially investment is going to be difficult. But it's not only private sector firms that invest, is it? It's also the government, again, as we've already seen, buying roads, building roads, schools, hospitals, so public sector investment. Now, how does the government afford it? Well, by raising taxation or by borrowing money. Okay, and if they borrow money, that means they've got a deficit. There's a deficit, a gap between the income that they're raising in taxation and their expenditure. Now that gap is known in this country as the public sector net cash requirement. Okay, the gap between the revenue that the government is receiving from taxation and their expenditure. Now, an interesting phenomenon, not all economists subscribe to this view, but it's worth pointing out, is this phenomenon of crowding out. And there is a view that if the government invests too much, then that crowds out private sector investment. It makes it more difficult for the private sector to invest. And the logic is that the government borrows more money, that drives interest rates up, and that makes it more difficult for the private sector to borrow money. Okay, so it's worth being aware of this expression crowding out, that the government, probably with the best of intentions, inadvertently makes life more difficult for the private sector. Okay, now, section 2.2, the trade cycle or the business cycle. There's a lot of talk about this, in the news almost constantly. It's the whole sort of boom bust idea. So have a little look at this diagram, where here's time, and this is gross domestic product, perhaps, and this straight line represents a sort of trend growth rate. And I don't know, on average, perhaps the economy grows at 3% per annum. What we tend to experience, though, is these trade cycles. Yeah, a great phase, where we're doing much better than the trend, and then we slump down, and then we recover. Okay, now what do these letters represent? Well, A is where we first sort of tip over and we go into recession. Okay, the official definition of a recession, I think, is the economy shrinking for 2 successive quarters. Okay, and as I'm recording this lecture, the UK economy has been going through recession. We started to grow, and now there is a suspicion that we might slip back into a recession. They call that a double dip recession. Okay, but 2 quarters of negative growth is a recession. Okay, the economy then sort of plummets to its lowest point, which is known as a depression. However, at some point, hopefully the economy then starts to recover. So point C is a recovery phase. And then we go into a boom phase where the economy is doing fantastically compared with the trend growth rate. But then the whole thing happens again. Now let's have a look in a bit more detail at the characteristics of these phases in the trade cycle. So recession, first of all. What happens in a recession? Well, consumer demand falls. We all buy less. And therefore, investment projects, which have already been undertaken because investment takes a long time, begin to look unprofitable. Okay, orders are cut. Firms cut back on their inventory levels. Businesses start to fail. Okay, employment starts to fall or unemployment starts to rise. It says the price level might begin to fall, okay, or at least inflation, right? The increase in the price level will begin to fall. Confidence diminishes. Investment drops even more. Okay, expectations are that this is going to get worse. So we go into a downward spiral until we plummet into a depression at the bottom point. Okay, and it's in some ways it's a case of things can't get any worse at some stage, and then things will start to turn around. Quite often things turn around because of government policies. At that stage, the government will cut back on taxation and perhaps increase government expenditure, perhaps reduce interest rates to stimulate the economy. So we will then start to recover. Output and employment begin to rise. Expectations are more optimistic. So we start to invest again. Okay, there's an increase in demand, but we can meet that through increased production. Yeah, we can take on all these unemployed workers that have been standing idle for the last year or so. Okay, the average price level begins to creep up until eventually we hit the boom phase. Okay, and during the boom, everyone's fully utilised then, so unemployment is almost non-existent. So there will be bottlenecks. Okay, there's a lack of spare capacity. So as demand carries on increasing, the only thing that there is to give is price. So we get inflation. Businesses, though, are profitable. Expectations of the future are very optimistic. Okay, but typically at some stage, inflation starts to become such a big concern for the government that they take the heat out of the economy. They increase taxation, they reduce government expenditure, they increase interest rates, and things start to turn down again. Now, it's generally the aim of a government to try to avoid this whole boom-bust cycle and to try to keep the economy as far as they possibly can on this trend growth rate. Now, we've seen from recent experience that's easier said than done. Okay, and it's partly because this is a very difficult balancing act, isn't it? To be fair, for the government or the Bank of England, who are in control of interest rates, we're also highly exposed to external shocks to the economy. Things like oil prices, exchange rates, and so on. And also, there's a theory that actually this is not helped by the electoral cycle in the UK, where the government always tries to stimulate the economy just before an election. Okay, and therefore, following the election, they've got no choice but to then start to take the heat out of the economy again. So there is a view that governments don't help themselves by trying to tie the economic cycle in with the electoral cycle. But anyway, we digress. Let's have a look at inflation. Okay, so this is going to be a feature of sort of the recovery boom phase. So definition, increase in the price level. Okay, and if there's an increase in the price level, another way of saying that is there's a decline in the purchasing power of your money. Right, every pound that you have in your pocket can buy you less. So it's got reduced purchasing power. The opposite of inflation is deflation. Now, this doesn't happen very often, but that means the general price level is falling. Now, inflation is one of the key targets, isn't it, for a government? So why? Why is inflation so important? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, if there's inflation in your economy, it can cause a redistribution of income and wealth. And the way it works is it redistributes income in favour of borrowers away from, well, depending on how you look at it, lenders stroke savers. So imagine you've got £10,000 in the bank and it's earning 5% interest, but inflation's running at 10%. In a year's time, in real terms, you will have less money in the bank. Yeah, the purchasing power of your bank account will have gone down. Equally, if you're borrowing money, that's a great position, isn't it? Yeah, the real value of your debt has gone down. So inflation favours borrowers and penalises lenders. It also penalises people on fixed incomes. You know, imagine pensioners, for instance. Okay, if their pension is rising at a lower rate than the rate of inflation, then every single year they're worse off. It affects your balance of payments. The more inflation we have in this country, the less competitive UK goods are, and so the harder we find it to export. Now, this next heading talks about price signalling and noise. Now, we're going to see later that the price mechanism in an economy is an important signalling device for firms and consumers. The more inflation we have, basically, the less certainty there is in an economy. So it's very difficult to plan effectively as a business in times of rapidly rising prices. Wage bargaining becomes very difficult. Again, workers can see the purchasing power of their wages being eroded by inflation. So that can often lead to industrial disputes, strike action, which can have a detrimental impact on the whole economy. And inflation can also affect consumer behaviour. What sometimes happens is we stockpile. We can see prices have gone up. We think they're going to go up even more, so we stockpile. And that distorts the economy. It's very difficult, again, for firms to plan for that. It's very difficult for them to plan their stock levels and so on. Now, what causes inflation? Well, the theory is there are two causes. Two types of inflation. We've got demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. So demand pull inflation is where inflation is being caused by too much demand in the economy. We as consumers are spending too much money. As we're spending more and more and more, firms see an opportunity to increase their prices, and that's exactly what they do. They put their prices up, and that causes inflation. Now that will tend to happen particularly once the economy reaches a point of full employment. Firms simply can't produce any more at that point, so all they can do in the face of increasing demand is push their prices up. The other type of inflation, which is particularly in point at the moment, is cost push. Prices are going up because of an increase in the cost of production. So in particular from imports. So the price of imports, the price of raw materials, importantly the price of oil, for instance, that goes up. Firms have to put their own prices up. If their costs are going up and they're trying to preserve profit margins, they need to put their prices up. And again, that triggers inflation in the economy. Now, just looking at demand pull inflation in a little bit more detail, it says here there are two main causes of it. Fiscal. Now, whenever you see this word fiscal, it's all about government expenditure and taxation. That's what we call fiscal policy. So if a government increases its expenditure or reduces its taxation, the level of demand in the economy will rise, and that will tend to cause demand pull inflation. It can also be caused by credit. So the easier it is for consumers to borrow to get credit, the more money they will spend. And the more money they spend, the more demand pull inflation we have. Yeah. So the banks in recent times have been criticised, haven't they, for lending money too easily. Okay, one of the potential consequences of that would be demand pull inflation. Now the problem with this is inflation does tend to spiral. Okay, and what we get is this thing called a wage price spiral. So workers see prices in the shops going up, they ask for increased wages to compensate for that. And if they ask for increased wages, firms' costs go up, so they put their prices up again. Workers see the prices going up in the shops, so they ask for even higher wages, and so on. So we get this thing called a wage price spiral, and if you're not careful, that can become hyperinflation. So inflation which is out of control in the economy. So what does the government do about this? Well, there are two types of policy which a government can employ to influence the level of demand in the economy. So we used to call these the two levers that are at the disposal of the government. One lever is monetary policy, the other lever is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy we've already seen, it's all about government expenditure and taxation. Okay, and the gap between the two is obviously borrowing. Monetary policy is the ability of the government to, in particular, change the interest rate, but also change the exchange rate, that's part of monetary policy, and also influence the availability of credit. Okay, and again, there's been a lot of talk of that in the press recently, hasn't there, with the banking crisis, and you may have heard the expression quantitative easing. Okay, that's all about the government trying to get the banks to lend more money, okay, particularly to businesses. That's a part of monetary policy. Now, the other thing that governments have tried from time to time is to try to control the level of the money supply on the basis that the more money there is in circulation in the economy, the more inflation there will be. Okay, and that's met with limited success. So just bear in mind, monetary policy is about much more than the money supply. Monetary policy is, importantly, interest rates and exchange rates, but also things like the availability of credit. Now, these are the levers the government use to try to manage the level of aggregate demand, overall demand in the economy. The other thing they can do is they can try to influence aggregate supply in the economy. So fiscal and monetary policy would be what we call demand side policies. Anything which influences the supply side of the economy is obviously called a supply side policy. And we'll have a look at some supply side policies very shortly. Now, in more detail, how does monetary policy affect aggregate demand? Well, interest rates. Imagine the government increased its interest rates. The price of borrowing therefore goes up. Companies therefore can't borrow and they reduce their level of investment. Households, again, can't afford to borrow as much, and equally they're also paying a lot more in mortgage interest, so they reduce their level of consumption. If interest rates go up, the exchange rate also tends to go up. Okay, now the reason for that is foreign investors want to put their money into the UK to get the benefit of our higher interest rates. So there's an increase in the demand for sterling, which pushes the exchange rate up. overall there's a reduction in spending. Okay, and therefore there is a reduction in the level of aggregate demand in the economy. So what will happen? That will tend to reduce demand pull inflation, which may well be the objective. The downside, of course, is that it may increase unemployment, it might reduce economic growth, and it might put us into a recession. Fiscal policy. We've said, haven't we, it's all about government expenditure, taxation, and borrowing. A whole host of things, isn't it, that the government spends money on. Okay, so we don't really need to go through this. You know all this, don't you, what the government spends money. Taxation. Well, that's how we finance a lot of the expenditure. However, if there is a gap, then the government needs to borrow. And we've said, haven't we, that is the public sector net cash requirement. So, if the government increases borrowing and increases spending, that's known as an expansionary fiscal stance or an expansionary fiscal policy. If there's an increase in taxation but no increase in spending, then that's a contractionary fiscal stance. If there's an increase in both, then that's a neutral fiscal stance. Okay, now why would a government opt for an expansionary fiscal stance? Well, if they wanted to stimulate the economy, if they wanted to reduce the level of unemployment, if they wanted to stimulate economic growth. Why would a government want to go for a contractionary fiscal policy? Well, to take the heat out of the economy, to reduce the level of demand, okay, typically to reduce the level of inflation. And if the government are reasonably happy with where they are at the time, then they'll go with a neutral fiscal stance. Now, that's all about the demand within the economy. There are also economic policies which we can employ to affect the supply within the economy. So these are called supply side policies. And a lot of these are very sensible. The problem with supply side policies is they do tend to take a lot of time to implement, a lot of time to take effect. Demand side policies can hit virtually instantly. For instance, if the government raises interest rates, that has an impact almost straight away. Whereas supply side policies do tend to be more long term. Now, there are a group of economists, which we tend to refer to as supply side economists, who disagree with all the stuff that we've just been talking about. They think the government shouldn't be using fiscal and monetary policy to affect the level of aggregate demand. Okay, they think that the only outcome of demand management is that it causes inflation. It doesn't do any good in the long run. All it does is causes inflation. They disagree with raising taxation as a measure of controlling the level of demand, because they think that if we increase taxation, that's a disincentive to economic activity. That will put foreign firms off from basing themselves in the UK. It will mean that some of our most capable employees in the economy will leave. They'll emigrate. They'll go and work somewhere else where the tax rate is a lot lower. So they think taxation should be kept nice and low. And they also point to the thing that I was talking about earlier, that sometimes these government policies are not actually triggered by the economic outlook, they're triggered by the political outlook. Okay, and it's all about trying to get elected next time. So what would they suggest instead? Well, they would suggest supply side measures. So get the private sector involved. Okay, privatize all the nationalized industries, because the private sector operates in a much more efficient way than the public sector. So the private sector should be involved wherever possible. Reduce taxation to increase incentives to get foreign companies to base themselves in the UK, to make sure there isn't a brain drain, right, so that we don't lose our most capable people. Curb the power of trade unions. Okay, You're probably not old enough to remember the late 70s, early 80s when Maggie Thatcher was elected, but that was a huge part of her policy, was to do a bit of trade union bashing, okay, because the trade unions have basically brought the country to a standstill in the 70s. Improve education and training, okay, so that we can supply more. Right? It increases the quality of labour in the economy. Increase competition. It's all about the free market. Yeah, so deregulate. Yeah, privatise as much as you can. And if it's all about the free market, we need to remove any exchange controls. There has to be free movement of capital, okay, all around the world. Yeah, money should be free to move wherever you want it to. Okay, now that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of macroeconomics. So I hope that made sense. I know it's a bit quick, but I think that's the level of detail that you need to know for this paper. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop. It's a good place to stop because we're going to move away from macroeconomics into microeconomics. So if you want to have a quick break, grab a coffee, and then join me again, we will start to have a look through section 3. So I'll see you soon.